The air in our bedroom felt thin, charged with the kind of static that precedes a massive storm. I stood before the full-length mirror, my fingers trembling as I traced the hem of the navy blue silk dress. It was more than just fabric. It was a relic. My mother, Clara, had worn this to her final anniversary dinner, the silk still seemingly holding the echoes of her laughter and the faint, lingering scent of jasmine and antiseptic the dual aromas of her life as a dedicated nurse. "Are you sure about this?" Elena, Julian's voice broke the silence. He was standing by the window, the cold moonlight of a Dayton evening catching the sharp line of his jaw. He wasn't wearing his usual work sweater. He was in a charcoal suit, looking every bit the forensic accountant he was, calculated, precise, and unyielding. "I have to go, Julian," I whispered, cinching the waist of the dress. 3 years, 147 calls. He hasn't spoken to me since Eleanor took over that house. If tonight is his retirement, if this is the end of his career, I won't let him end it believing I abandoned him. Julian walked over, his hand reaching into his inner jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a gift or a flask of liquid courage. He pulled out a thick, manila envelope. The weight of it seemed to pull at the very air in the room. "Then you need to know what you're walking into," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I didn't want to tell you until I was certain." I spent the last 72 hours cross-referencing Arthur's pension filings with the digital signatures Eleanor's IP address submitted to the firm. "Elena, your father didn't just stop calling you. He was systematically erased from his own financial life." I looked at the envelope, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "Arthur thinks he's retiring into a golden sunset," Julian said, his eyes hard. "But Eleanor and Cassandra have turned that sunset into a fire sale. They've rerouted the beneficiaries. They've leveraged his 401k against Cassandra's failed boutique debts. But the worst part isn't the money, Elena. It's the signature. It's a ghost. Someone has been signing his name for 8 months, and it wasn't him." I felt the silk of my mother's dress turn cold against my skin. My father, Arthur Sterling, was a man of steel and structure. He was a foreman who could spot a structural flaw in a skyscraper from a mile away, yet he was blind to the rot inside his own living room. Eleanor had spent a decade replacing our oak tables with marble, our memories with modernity, and finally replacing me with her own daughter, Cassandra. "He hates me, Julian," I said, my voice cracking. "Eleanor told me he never wants to see me again. She said I was a reminder of a life he wanted to forget." "Eleanor is a master of load-bearing lies," Julian replied, stepping closer to adjust the collar of my mother's dress. "She knows exactly how much pressure to put on a person before they break. She's spent 3 years convincing him you left, and 3 years convincing you he hates you. Tonight, we aren't just going to a zero Y, we're going to perform a structural audit." I took a deep breath, the jasmine scent of the dress giving me a flicker of strength. I grabbed my clutch, the old photograph of my father carrying me on his shoulders at a construction site tucked safely inside. I didn't know then that within 2 hours, I would be on a hardwood floor, humiliated in front of 80 people. I didn't know that my father would look at me with the eyes of a stranger and tell me to get out. But as Julian opened the car door for me, his face a mask of professional resolve, I knew one thing: the things you can't see are indeed the things that keep everything standing. And tonight, I was going to find out exactly what was left of our foundation. The Willowbrow Country Club was a fortress of limestone and polished glass tucked away at the end of a long, winding drive lined with ancient oaks. As Julian steered the car through the gates, the headlights caught the manicured greens of the golf course shimmering under a thin layer of evening frost. It looked perfect. It looked expensive. It looked like a world that had no room for the grit of a construction site or the smell of a hospital ward. Inside, the foyer was a cacophony of clinking crystal and the low, rehearsed hum of elite socialites. A massive portrait of my father, Arthur Sterling, stood on a gilded easel near the entrance. He was smiling in the photo, shaking hands with the CEO, looking every bit the legendary foreman who had kept the company's structural integrity intact for 3.5 decades. I approached the seating chart, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My eyes scanned the head table: Arthur Sterling, Eleanor Sterling, Cassandra Sterling, and 3 senior executives. My name was nowhere. I scanned the rest of the tables: Table 4, Table 8, Table 12. Finally, I found it. At the very back of the room, tucked between a heavy stone pillar and the swinging doors of the kitchen service corridor, was a small 2-person table. No centerpiece, no nameplate, just 2 chairs and a basket of cold bread. Table 22, Julian muttered, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the distance between us and the head table. They didn't just forget you, Elena. They quarantined you. It's fine. I lied, my voice thin. I'm just here to see him. As we walked toward our isolated corner, the lights dimmed. A projector screen hummed to life above the podium. 35 Years of Excellence, the title slide read. Then the photos began. It was a masterpiece of revisionist history. There was Arthur at the plant in the 90s, Arthur receiving his 20-year pin. But then the family photos started, and the air left my lungs. There was a photo of Arthur and Eleanor at a vineyard in Napa, Arthur and Cassandra at her high school graduation, Arthur, Eleanor, and Cassandra laughing on the porch of the house I grew up in, the house my mother had decorated with her own hands. Slide after slide, my mother was absent. I was absent. It was as if the first 25 years of Arthur's life had been lived in a vacuum, only to suddenly begin the moment Eleanor walked into our lives. 35 years of my father's legacy, and Linda Sterling, the woman who had supported him when he was nothing but a junior apprentice, had been edited out of existence. It was a digital execution. Elena, look at her, Julian whispered. I looked toward the head table. Eleanor was bathed in the glow of the projector. She wore a charcoal Hermes scarf draped over a fitted black gown, her posture regal. She wasn't watching the screen. She was watching the room, measuring the impact of her narrative. Beside her, Cassandra leaned into my father, her hand resting on his arm with a proprietary air. She looked like the perfect daughter. She looked like she belonged. Suddenly, a shadow fell over our table. Oh, Elena, I honestly didn't think you'd have the nerve to show up. Eleanor stood before us. Her smile landed on me like a camera flash, bright, blinding, and gone in a heartbeat. She didn't look at my face. Her eyes went straight to my dress. She recognized it. I saw the slight tightening of her jaw as she took in the navy silk. The invitation said family, I replied, standing up to meet her gaze. Family is a word for those who stay dear, Eleanor said, her voice a poisonous honey. She touched my elbow, her grip surprisingly strong, steering me further into the shadow of the pillar. Your father is happy, for the first time since. Well, for a very long time. Don't ruin his night with your needs. You've already cost him enough peace. I haven't asked him for a dime, Eleanor. I just wanted to talk to my father. He has nothing to say to a daughter who disappeared the moment things got difficult. She snapped, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. She leaned in closer, her breath smelling of expensive gin and mint. Walk away, Elena. Take your husband and leave through the back door. If you stay, I will make sure everyone in this room knows exactly why you were written out of the program. She patted my arm twice, a gesture of mock affection, and glided back toward the light of the head table. Julian's hand found mine under the table. He didn't say a word, but he squeezed my fingers. I could feel the manila envelope resting against his leg. The structural audit was about to begin, but first, I had to survive the collapse. The applause for the slideshow died down, replaced by the polite clinking of silverware against fine china. Waiters in white gloves glided through the room like ghosts, serving sea bass and aged rye. At the head table, my father was a king in his castle. He looked robust, his shoulders broad under his tuxedo, but there was a stiffness in his neck that only I recognized. It was the posture he assumed when he was holding back a storm. I looked at Julian. He didn't need to say a word. He gave me a single, firm nod. This was it. I stood up, the navy silk of my mother's dress whispering against my legs. Every step I took toward the elevated platform felt like walking through deep water. I passed table 10, where Phil, an old colleague of my father's, lived. He squinted at me through his glasses, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Elena, is that you, kid?" he whispered. I didn't stop. I couldn't. If I broke my momentum, I would shatter. I stepped onto the 6-inch riser of the head table. The wooden floor groaned slightly, a structural complaint. Cassandra saw me first. Her perfect curls bounced as she stiffened, her hand tightening on my father's forearm. Eleanor's eyes snapped to mine, a predator realizing the prey had wandered into the clearing. "Dad," I said. My voice was small, but in the sudden vacuum of silence at the head table, it sounded like a gunshot. Arthur Sterling turned. His jaw was set so hard I could see the muscle pulsing in his cheek. He didn't look like the man who used to carry me on his shoulders. He looked like a statue carved from cold, gray granite. "I asked you to talk for 3 years, Dad," I said, my voice gaining a jagged edge of desperation. "I called. I came to the house. Why did you close the door?" Eleanor stood up, her voice a practiced melody of concern for the audience. "Arthur, dear, she's clearly unstable. The stress of her financial troubles must be catching up to her financial troubles." I barked a laugh that felt like glass in my throat. "I'm a lead engineer, Eleanor. I don't have financial troubles. I have a family trouble." I reached out, my hand trembling, intending to touch my father's shoulder. I wanted to feel the warmth of the man who had raised me. But before my fingers could make contact, my father stood up. He moved with the sudden, violent efficiency of the foreman he had been for 35 years. He didn't speak. He reached out with both hands, placed them on my shoulders, and pushed. The world tilted. My heels caught the edge of the riser. I went backward, my arms flailing for a grip that wasn't there. I hit the hardwood floor hard. The impact vibrated through my spine, a dull, sickening thud that echoed in the silent room. And then I heard it, a sharp, rhythmic tear. The seam of my mother's dress, the dress she had cherished, the dress that was the last physical tether I had to her, split open along the hem. It was the sound of a heart breaking. "That seat is for my real daughter." "Get out!" My father's voice didn't just carry, it commanded. He looked down at me from the height of the platform, his face twisted in a mask of righteous fury. "You turned your back on this family when you stopped caring. You only show up when there's a celebration to ruin or a legacy to claim. You lost the right to sit here 3 years ago." Cassandra sat back down, sliding into the empty chair beside him, my chair. She adjusted her Tiffany pendant and looked at me with a pity so fake it made my skin crawl. "It's okay, Dad," she cooed, rubbing his arm. "She can't hurt us anymore. We're safe now. 80 people, 80 pairs of eyes." I sat on that cold floor, the torn silk pulling around my knees. I looked at the colleagues who had known me since I was a toddler, the executives who had praised my father's integrity. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence was a physical weight, pressing me into the wood. I felt a tear sting my eye, but I refused to let it fall. I stared at my father, and for the first time, I didn't see a hero. I saw a man whose foundation had been completely hollowed out by the people he trusted most. And then, from the back of the room, the sound of a chair scraping back broke the spell. Julian was coming, and he wasn't coming to comfort me. He was coming to tear the house down. The silence that followed my father's outburst wasn't just quiet, it was vacuum sealed. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a bridge collapses, a structural groan that everyone hears but no one wants to acknowledge. I was still on the floor, my hand gripping the torn silk of my mother's dress, when I heard the rhythmic, measured click of leather solace against the hardwood. Julian didn't run, he didn't shout, He walked toward the head table with the unhurried grace of a man who already knew the ending of the story he was about to tell. As he passed the tables of stunned executives, he reached up and calmly buttoned his suit jacket a single, precise motion. It was his war footing. He reached me, but he didn't look down. He kept his eyes fixed on my father. He offered me his hand, and as I took it, his grip was as steady as a steel pylon. He pulled me up, brushed a speck of dust from my shoulder with a tenderness that made my throat ache, and then turned his full attention to the man on the platform. "Mr. Sterling," Julian began. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a resonant, clinical clarity that cut through the room like a laser. "I'm Julian, Helena's husband. The daughter you just assaulted in front of your peers. Take her and get out, Julian," my father growled, though I noticed his eyes flicker toward the CEO at the next table. "This is a private matter. Actually, sir, when a man spent 35 years building a reputation for integrity, only to throw it away on a lie, it becomes a public tragedy," Julian replied. He stepped closer to the platform, invading my father's personal space just enough to be uncomfortable. "But I'm not here to talk about manners. I'm here because I'm a forensic accountant. And in my world, people lie, emotions lie, but the ledger is the only thing that tells the truth." Eleanor stepped forward, her face a mask of patronizing concern. "Julian, please, you're making a scene. Elena has clearly filled your head with fantasies because she's bitter about her own failures." Julian finally looked at her. It was a cold, predatory gaze. "Fantasies, Eleanor. Is that what we're calling the $180,000 in consulting fees that moved out of Arthur's diversified equity fund over the last 8 months? Fees that, strangely enough, match the exact debt profile of Cassandra's failed boutique in the city." The room gasped. It was a collective, sharp intake of breath. Cassandra's face went from pale to ghostly white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "What are you talking about?" my father demanded, his brow furrowing. "I don't have a boutique debt. I don't even have a consulting line item in my accounts." "I know you don't, Arthur," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because you haven't seen your accounts in 3 years. You've been signing summaries prepared by your wife, haven't you? Documents that told you your daughter was asking for money, when in reality, she was the only one trying to protect your legacy." Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope. He didn't toss it. He set it on the white linen tablecloth with the solemnity of a judge passing a sentence. "Inside this envelope are 2 documents, Arthur," Julian continued, ignoring Eleanor's hand as she tried to reach for it. "One is your original pension beneficiary form from 1995. The one where you named Elena as your primary heir. The second was filed 8 months ago via an encrypted email. It names Cassandra as the sole beneficiary of 100% of your estate." "I never signed that," my father whispered, his voice finally cracking. "I know," Julian said, leaning in, "and that's where it gets interesting. Because whoever signed your name on that second form made a very specific mistake. A mistake only someone who studied your handwriting but didn't live your life would make." Julian flipped the envelope open, revealing the 2 signatures side by side. "Arthur, look at the capital S. You've had arthritis in your right thumb for 5 years. You haven't been able to finish closed loop S since 2019. But the person who signed this, they have very smooth, very healthy hands." Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "This is ridiculous. You're accusing me of forgery at a retirement party." "Security." But the security guards didn't move. They were looking at the CEO, and the CEO was looking at the documents. The word security hung in the air, vibrating with Eleanor's desperation, but the room remained frozen. The guards, men who had worked under my father's command at the plant for years, didn't move an inch. They looked at Arthur, then at the CEO, then at the manila envelope. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. The king was no longer on his throne. He was under a microscope. Julian leaned over the table, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that felt more menacing than a shout. Cassandra, you're very quiet. Does the number $180,000 ring a bell? Or perhaps the Sterling Foundation for Youth, a shell company registered to APO Box in Delaware that Eleanor opened last spring. Cassandra's breath hitched. She looked at her mother, her eyes wide and pleading. Mom, you said ... you said it was handled. You said he signed it. The admission slipped out like a physical blow. Eleanor's hand flew to Cassandra's arm, her fingers digging in so hard I could see the girl wince. Shut up, Cassandra, Eleanor hissed, her poise finally disintegrating. My father looked at Cassandra, then at Eleanor. The gray granite of his face seemed to crack, revealing a raw, bleeding confusion. Handled? What was handled, Eleanor? I thought the money we sent to the foundation was for the company's scholarship fund. You told me it was a tax write-off for my retirement. It was, Arthur. He's lying, Eleanor screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Julian. He's a forensic accountant. He's trained to manufacture evidence. He's doing this for Eleanor because she's greedy. I'm not the one who changed the locks on the safe deposit box, Eleanor, I said, my voice steady for the first time that night. I stepped up to the edge of the platform, looking her in the eye. I'm not the one who told Dad I was too busy to visit while I was actually sitting in a hospital parking lot, crying because you wouldn't let me in. You didn't just steal his money. You stole his daughter. You tried to replace a lifetime of memories with a balance sheet. Julian reached into the envelope again and pulled out a single, laminated sheet of paper. This is the kill shot, Eleanor. It's a call log. Not from Eleanor's phone, from Arthur's. Or rather, the phone you told him was malfunctioning. Over 300 blocked incoming calls from Eleanor's number. And 64 outgoing messages to her, all deleted within seconds of being sent. My father grabbed the log. His eyes scanned the dates. December 23rd, Christmas morning. New Year's Eve, his birthday. I sent these ... double quotes, he whispered, his voice trembling. I thought you were ignoring me, Fei. I thought you had moved on to your new life and didn't have room for a retired old man. I never got them, Dad, I said, a tear finally escaping and hot on my cheek. She blocked me. She told me you hated me. The room was no longer silent. A low, angry murmur was building among the guests. Phil, the old colleague, stood up from his table. Rick, we all wondered why the kid wasn't around. We asked Eleanor, and she said Eleanor was traveling abroad and didn't want to be bothered with work talk. Eleanor backed away from the table, her heels clicking frantically against the wood. This is a setup. You're all against me. Arthur, tell them how much I've done for you. But my father wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the woman who had just stood up from the far corner of the room. Donna Webb, the benefits coordinator, walked toward the head table with a leather folio tucked under her arm. She looked like a schoolteacher about to correct a very bad student. Mr. Sterling, Donna said, her voice calm and authoritative. I believe there's one more document you need to see. Something that arrived on my desk just 48 hours ago. It's a request to liquidate your entire $401,000 into a private offshore account, effective the Monday after your retirement. She opened her folio and handed a paper to Arthur. The signature on this one isn't even a good forgery, sir. It looks like it was signed in a hurry. By someone who knew the clock was ticking. My father took the paper. He didn't even need to look at the signature. He looked at Eleanor. The man who had spent 35 years ensuring that every beam, every bolt, and every weld was perfect, finally saw the catastrophic failure in his own home. The revelation of the offshore account was the final blow. My father held the paper as if it were a live wire, his eyes darting from the forged signature to the woman he had called his wife for 10 years. The modern life Eleanor had built for him, the marble tables, the designer watches, the high society parties. It wasn't a gift. It was a shroud designed to keep him blind while she dissected his legacy. An offshore account, Eleanor. My father's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. The foreman was back, the man who could tell if a weld was weak just by the sound of a hammer. You were going to empty everything on Monday. Well, I was supposed to be celebrating my first day of freedom. Eleanor didn't cry. She wasn't the type for soft emotions. Instead, she did something much more chilling. She laughed. It was a sharp, jagged sound that scraped against the silence of the ballroom. She stepped back, her heels clicking a frantic, irregular rhythm, and she pulled her charcoal scarf tied around her neck like armor. Freedom, she spat, the mask of the graceful hostess finally falling away to reveal the cold opportunist beneath. You think you're a king, Arthur. You're a man who smells like grease and cold steel. I gave you 10 years of status. I turned a rough-necked foreman into someone who could walk into this club without being mistaken for the janitor. She swept her arm across the head table, knocking over a crystal water goblet. The water soaked into the white linen, spreading like a stain. I earned that money. I spent a decade listening to your boring stories about load-bearing beams and integrity while I managed your life, your house, and your pathetic daughter's drama. If I didn't take it, you would have just wasted it on her anyway. Cassandra let out a whimpering sob, burying her face in her hands. Mom, stop it. Please, don't you mom me. Eleanor turned on her own daughter with a venom that made me recoil. Who do you think paid for that boutique? Who do you think covered your tracks when you blew through your trust fund in 6 months? I did this for us. My father stepped off the platform. He didn't push her. He didn't even raise his hand. He simply walked toward her until she was forced to stop her tirade. He was a head taller than her, a mountain of a man who had suddenly remembered his own strength. You didn't do it for us, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. You did it for a version of a life that never existed. You pulled up my wife's garden because you couldn't stand that something beautiful grew here before you. You threw away my table because it was built with honest hands. And you tried to bury my daughter because she's the only one who actually knows who I am. He turned to the room, to the 80 people who had watched him humiliate me only 20 minutes prior. I want to apologize, he said, his voice echoing, not to you. To my daughter, he looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years, the wall was gone. They Dejong, I am a man who builds things to last. But I let the most important structure in my life rot from the inside out. I was a fool. Eleanor tried to bolt for the exit, but Donna Webb was already standing near the door with 2 of the security guards. The police are on their way, Eleanor, Donna said, her voice clipped. Identity theft and financial fraud over $100,000 is a felony in this state. I think you should wait in the foyer. As the guards led a screaming, struggling Eleanor and a trembling Cassandra out of the room, the ballroom remained in a state of shock. The perfect family had been hollowed out in less than an hour. Julian stepped up beside me, placing a hand on the small of my back. We should go, Elena, he whispered. The audit is over. But my father was walking toward me. He didn't care about the executives or the scandal. He stopped a foot away, his eyes fixed on the torn hem of my navy blue dress. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers touching the silk of my mother's gown. I ruined it, he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. I ruined her dress. It can be mended, Dad, I said, my voice breaking. Everything can be mended if the foundation is still there. The aftermath of the retirement party was not a quiet affair. As Eleanor and Cassandra were escorted out, the grand ballroom of the Willowbrow Country Club felt cavernous and cold, the remaining guests whispering in small, hurried clusters. The perfect facade had not just cracked. It had disintegrated, leaving behind the raw, ugly truth of a decade of deception. My father, the man who had once commanded hundreds of workers with a single look, seemed to have aged 10 years in a single hour. He stood in the center of the room, his tuxedo suddenly looking too large for his frame. Julian stayed by my side, a silent sentinel, his hand a steady weight on my shoulder. I need to go home, my father whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves. I need to see the house, but it wasn't the house Eleanor had decorated that he wanted to see. When we arrived at the property an hour later, the limestone mansion felt like a mausoleum. My father didn't go to the master bedroom or the marble-topped dining room. He walked straight to the garage. He fumbled with the heavy door, his breath hitching in the dark. When the fluorescent lights flickered on, they revealed a graveyard of memories. 3 cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly in a corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. And there, shoved behind a lawnmower, was the oak table. It was scarred, the wood dull and neglected, but the structure was intact. My father fell to his knees beside it. He ran his hand over the surface, finding the small, jagged initials he had helped me carve when I was 8 years old. He let out a broken, jagged sob, the sound of a man who had finally found his way back to the only thing that was real. "She told me you threw it away," he choked out, looking up at me. "She told me you said it was trash and that you wanted me to move on. Every time I asked about your mother's things, she said you had taken them to sell. I believed her because I couldn't imagine a person could be that cruel. I never took anything, Dad," I said, kneeling beside him in the dust. "I spent 3 years thinking you were trying to erase us. I thought you didn't want the burden of the past anymore." The legal battle that followed was swift and clinical. With Julian's forensic trail and Donna Webb's testimony, the Sterling Foundation for Youth was exposed as a blatant money laundering front. Eleanor was charged with grand larceny and multiple counts of forgery. Cassandra, though she claimed ignorance, was forced to liquidate her remaining assets to pay back the initial $180,000. They didn't leave with dignity. They left with the bitter realization that Arthur Sterling was not a man to be underestimated when he finally had his eyes open. 6 months later, the limestone house was sold. My father moved into a smaller, sun-drenched bungalow 3 blocks away from our apartment. It was a modest place, but it had a yard large enough for a real garden. The first thing we moved in was the oak table. We spent a weekend in the sun, Julian, my father, and I, sanding down the years of neglect. We applied fresh oil to the wood until it glowed with a deep, honeyed warmth. We didn't need marble, we didn't need charcoal scarves, or designer watches. We needed the honesty of the grain. On a Sunday evening, we sat down for dinner. The table had 3 chairs just like it used to. One for my father, one for me, and one for Julian. But in the center of the table, in a small crystal vase, was a single bunch of coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, the flowers my mother had loved. My father looked at me, then at the torn navy blue dress, which had been expertly mended by a local tailor, the seam now stronger than the original fabric. He reached out and took my hand. "Everything holds up something else, Daddy Jang," he said, his voice finally steady. "I forgot that the strongest beams aren't the ones made of steel. They're the ones made of truth. Thank you for not letting the house fall down." As we ate, the silence in the room wasn't heavy anymore. It was light. It was the sound of a foundation that had been tested by a storm and had finally settled into the earth, solid and unshakable.